Good morning. It's good to see everybody. I mean that sincerely too, by the way. I don't just say that. It's such a good pleasure to be here among you. I want to real quickly, again, discuss a little bit about what's coming up next week, next Sunday at 4 with this workshop. And I know that some of you may be thinking, well, I have nothing to offer, or I don't need to worry about it. I don't really think he expects anybody to be there. Actually, I do. I'm hoping that every single person here and on Zoom will be here. I think it's that important. It's not only is it helpful for us individually, that's my prayer, but it will be helpful for us as a congregation. It's really difficult to put, one of the things that I was asked to do when I came, and I completely understand why, was to put some kind of something together so that we can reach out into the community. I delayed that as long as I could because I wanted to get to know everybody first. But it's time. It's time to start moving in that direction. In fact, that's the reason we spent this whole year talking about the fruit of the Spirit. So help get us in the right mindset and hopefully encourage us all to be moving in that direction. And now we're going to be looking at, as we get into what we're talking about now with joy, this for the next 5 or 6 weeks, and then after that, love. You'll see how this all connects, and we kind of transfer it then from being about us and our personal growth to actually how we can help other people develop the same kind of growth. That's the goal. That's what we're looking forward to. It's not just about who we are and what we do. It's about who we affect. And so next year, we're going to be looking at that, and I'm hoping that we can, by coming together as a congregation, we talk about the things that we can do, and we're not going to spend time talking about the things that we can't do. We're going to spend the time talking about what is it that we can do, what are our strengths, what are our talents, what are the skills that we have, and we're going to be as specific as possible so that we include as many people as possible in the work of the church so that we can grow thereby. Ephesians chapter 4 teaches us that. That's how the growth comes, when all the parts are doing all the parts of the body are doing their parts. And so that's really what we're looking at, how to get involved in that, and we're starting the conversation because it's important. And I've done too many things in the church in different places that didn't have the support of the people that were doing it. And I've learned my lesson. I'm not going to create a huge program where we are going to go out and do all this work if everyone's not on board with it. It's ridiculous, first of all, because that just means I'm going to end up doing all the work, which isn't going to happen. I can't evangelize Caddo Mills by myself. There's no possible way to do it. And all of us together, we can, but it's going to take some time, right? We're going to multiply our efforts, and we're going to have a synergistic work so that we are working together. And, synergism is such an interesting word, because if you have two people and they can both lift individually 100 pounds apiece, and you put them together, they can lift more than 200 pounds. It's probably going to be more like 250 or 300. That's because they're working together, and that's the way the church is. So anyway, that's the reason we're having that, is to encourage us in the right direction. Related to that, I guess we could say we're talking about joy, and this is the opposite of joy we're talking about this week or tonight. The opposite of joy, then, of course, is let me see. I got to figure out how to do it. The opposite of joy, of course, is misery, right? And joy, really, if we're talking about the fruit of the Spirit, we're talking about how we have the last few weeks, we're talking about peace, being peacemakers, looking at relationships that we're in. And we start seeing that when we start doing good deeds and we start looking around how we can improve the lives of other people and be useful to them, we start looking at relationships that we have. We may start having to mend fences. We have to start putting things together, again, that may have been torn apart. There's so much that relates to peace, that relates just to being able to deal with people skills, right? And so we talked a little bit about that. We talked a little bit about what it takes to mend broken relationships, for example. And we talked about what it means to bring peace. But in looking at joy, we recognize that joy is really a step beyond peace. Joy is actually a byproduct, but it's also something that we can create and manufacture. James chapter 1 teaches us that, for example. That we consider all joy when we fall into various trials. We consider what it takes for us to have joy in a situation. Of course, God is the one who brings about joy. And if you look at how the word joy is used in the Bible, it's often dealt in dealing with the relationship that we have with God, and that is the ultimate joy that we can have. But we also have relationships with each other that we can enjoy very much, and that is where joy comes from. So joy stems from the interactions and the relationship that we have with other people, those who are outside of us. And when we have relationships with other people, we can enjoy those if they're good relationships. We have to deal with not just the negative aspect of making sure we get along, but also the positive aspect of building those relationships and building those bonds, which is part of why we're here together to begin with. It's something that we often disregard. And it's certainly something that we should focus on. So joy is all about building those bonds, those relationships with one another, especially that relationship with God. Now, if you have dealt with people at all that have divorced, you'll probably understand a little bit of what's been said when I say this. There's sometimes, and it's usually with men, they don't see it coming at all. Have no idea it's coming. They go home and everything's gone. One man, I heard about a story, said a woman even took the ice trays out of the freezer. He had no idea. And you think, yeah, there's no way. He had to have something. And if you look back on a relationship like that, if you're discerning and you look back on it, he could probably find some clues, some hints. But there's no doubt that it takes people by surprise sometimes. And Jesus even said that that's the way it's going to be at the end of time. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21, Jesus said that not everyone says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. And then he starts talking about how they'll come to him and say, Lord, have we not done this and that? Have we not prophesied in your name? We cast out demons in your name, done many wonders in your name. And he'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. That's going to be a surprise for people. And certainly we don't want to be there. So we're going to look at this. It's going to be actually a series of lessons on witnesses of spiritual failure. And the reason I'm bringing it up in that sense is because it's thinking about if we have already faced, for example, the man facing divorce, and he's looking back and thinking about what he did in his relationship, what little clues here and there, what would he see? What are the things that would bubble up that would be a witness to the problems that he just ignored and didn't fix? Spiritually, we can be the same way. So we're going to look at that idea about what it is we can do and why it's such an important idea. First one that we want to look at, this is actually the relationship has to do with deeds, things. This whole thing, one of the first witness of a problem of a failed relationship with God is deeds. The first part of that is things that we do that are sinful. That's the most obvious one, right? Romans chapter 3 and verse 23 says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all understand this. We know these things like the back of our hands. We know that whenever we sin, we are violating God's laws and we don't have a good relationship with him. Romans chapter 6 and verse 23 says the wages of sin is death. The free gift of God is eternal life. So we understand that when we do things that are wrong, we sin against God and we are going to suffer the consequences of it. In fact, if you look over in Romans chapter 2, starting in verse 6, he says, who will render to each one according to his deeds. Eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory, honor, and immortality. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish on every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first, and also of the Greek. But glory, honor, and peace to everyone who works what is good, to the Jew first and also the Greek, for there is no partiality with God. It's important for us to understand in the context here why he's talking about the partiality, because the Jews had it in their mind. They were the people of God. And they would condemn the Gentiles for doing things, and then they would turn around and do the same things or similar things and think nothing of it. And Paul's point here is that these people are you're going to be lost just like the other people will be because of the things that you do. God is not a respecter of persons. Just because they were the Jewish people and the people, the children of God in that sense, didn't mean that they got a free pass to do whatever they wanted to do. And as Christians, we need to be careful of that, lest we fall into the same mindset that says, I'm a Christian, I'm right with God. Yes, we can all look at our lives. This is the reasoning we can give. We all look at our lives. We all know that we have sin from time to time. We all know that we have troubles and problems and weaknesses and temptations, just like everyone else does. But we're saved by the blood of Christ. It doesn't really matter then if I sin, because everyone sins. And soon we start taking sin for granted, and we think it's not that big a deal. Oh, I can just get forgiveness later. When we reach that point, we have violated, and we need to come to a realization that we're stepping against the very nature of God, and that our relationship has been hurt and hindered because of that. So if at the end of life, if we look and we're standing before God and he says, depart from me, I never knew you, and we think back on our lives, one of the reasons for that will be because of the things that we do, and we fool ourselves into thinking everything's okay. That's a very dangerous place for it to be. And it's complicated by the fact that we have God's grace thrown in, right? So this is a warning for all of us that even though we understand God's grace and we have confidence that God has forgiven us, that does not necessarily mean that we're right with God. We need to look at our activities. What is it that we do? How is it that we behave? And if we live a life that is habitually sinning, that we continue on in it without stopping, we make no effort to stop, we just have given up and think, well, God's grace will cover this eventually. We've misunderstood and we're abusing God's relationship with us. This is something that's very important to recognize. The second one here is things that we refuse to do that are required. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 through 23, which I just quoted earlier, tells us that basically what they were doing was they were doing all these things that God never required for them to do. God has not made it a stipulation of his in the New Testament that in order to be saved, you have to go out and cast demons and heal the sick. He didn't say that. It's never been part of what he wanted us to do. Now, he did give them that information, that ability to do those things, but the reason was not so that they could be saved. The reason was so that they could influence other people and show them that what they were telling them to do was true. It was not based upon that ability. And so what they did was they replaced obedience for God with their power to do the things that God gave them power to do. It's very easy for us to do that. We need to be careful that we don't replace God's will, put aside God's will, and do what we want to do. So it's not just refusing to do what is right. Now, if we, in James chapter 4, in verse 17, it says, if we know to do he who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. So we sin against ourselves. We sin in the sense that we hurt ourselves. We shoot ourselves in the foot because we're not doing what we know we should be doing. That certainly is part of what we're talking about when we talk about things that we refuse to do. But usually it's a replacement that's going on. Instead of just ignoring God's will altogether, we just kind of replace it with something else. Have you ever done this? I've catch myself doing this at work sometimes here. I catch myself. I'll have a day where it feels like I did a lot of work, but I didn't get anything accomplished. Has any of you had that happen before? Now look back on the day and I realize I've done a lot of things, but they really weren't what I needed to be doing for the day. And so I've been busy doing things, but it wasn't really productive because I didn't push forward the needle, so to speak. And I usually, when I do those kinds of things, if you do it too many times, you're in trouble, right? So there are times when I'm looking around going, where did my week go? We do that with God. We do that with his word. because we are busy doing a lot of things, but they're not really the things that God wants us to be doing and be involved in. And we need to make sure we understand what that is then. Busy about doing God's will. We also need to recognize that part of this means that these are things that we say people must do, but we don't do. It's a whole lot easier to tell everyone what they need to do, but we don't just ignore ourselves, right? If I tell everyone else they can't do this or they should do this, I don't have to do it because they're doing it for me, right? I remember one of the first the first work that I had, I was talking to a man, one of the members, and he said, don't take this wrong. Don't be offended by this. And of course I was, but that's why he started off with that phrase that usually makes me kind of perk up, go, okay, what's about to come, right? He said, I work, I have a job. I didn't have a job, evidently, but he had a job. And his job was to work and earn a living, give money to the church to pay me to evangelize. He didn't have to do it because I was the one that was supposed to do it. He hired me out to do that. And he said, don't be offended by that. Well, that's offensive. I'm not a slave. I'm not a servant. I'm serving the church, surely, but it's not like you can punch your ticket by having someone else do your work. It's not going to happen. So we need to understand, that's why we need to understand who we are and what we can do, what we should be doing. Not everyone should be doing the same things. And if any congregation that leaves the impression that there's only one thing that you can do as a Christian and everyone has to do it, they got it wrong. Because my Bible reads that there are many parts to this body. And we all are important. We all have different functions. And we need to figure out how to work together so that we can walk and run and do the things that we should be doing as Christians. And so when he says this in James chapter 2, we need to keep in mind that it's easy for us to tell other people what to do. We need to make sure we turn the fingers around it ourselves. He says in verse 14, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. See, here's that argument that came up before, where this man said, I have money, you have evangelism. Similar idea. I have faith, you have works. You have faith, I have works. He says, show me your faith without your works. You can't do it. So if you want to have a faith, you're going to have to do something, right? We all have things to do. And that's no secret. We all know that. So we need to be busy about doing the things that we say other people should do. It's a whole lot easier to do it that way, though, to tell people that what they should do. And I really would much rather do that, to be honest with you. I'd rather just sit around telling everyone what to do than actually doing it myself. Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 8, this is something Jesus said often about the leadership of that time. It says, Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seats. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at the feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. And they love to elevate themselves. This kind of goes back to the one previous to this too, but they would replace doing the things that God wanted them to do. They spent all their time enlarging their phylacteries, right? Their garments had to have certain materials on them. And they would make them as big as they could. And it was competition, I guess, to see who had the biggest hems around the edges of their garments. All kinds of ridiculous things that they would spend their time doing things that are worthless. And they tell everyone to do all this work and all these things, but they wouldn't lift a finger to do it themselves. And so the first thing that we ought to do to test whether or not we should be telling someone to do something, whether we should tell them to do it should be determined by whether or not we would do it. If we're telling other people to do something that we wouldn't do, that sure is an indication that we're saying but not doing, right? And it's easy for churches to get caught up into this if we're not careful. We can put burdens on people that we wouldn't expect. In their situation, we wouldn't do the same things. So we're putting burdens on them where if we were in their shoes, we wouldn't do what we were expecting them to do. It wouldn't make sense. And so this is a very important idea. And these are, of course, indicators that our relationship with God there's something wrong in there somewhere, right? Because if we're telling people to do things we're not even willing to do, there's something in our relationship with God that is a miss. It's askew. We need to be careful of where we are and look into it. And then, of course, we have things we say people must do. How do we do that? That we must not do, but that we do, okay? And that's really the same idea. There's so many other passages. I have the same ones listed there, but there are a lot of ideas related to that. We tell people they cannot do these things, and yet we turn around and do them ourselves. This is the one that most people look at us and say, well, they're hypocrites, right? This is what the world around us looks at Christians, people who call themselves Christians, and they see the hypocrisy, and they see people who say not to do certain things, and they say, well, they're doing the same things. Romans chapter 2 tells us that very thing, which we already read before. And if you look over there, I think that we can get a little bit more out of that in the insights. Romans chapter 2. We'll start with the first verse there. It says, therefore you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge, practice the same things. But we know that the judgment of God is according to truth against those who practice such things. And you think this, O man, you who judge those practicing such things and doing the same, that you will escape the judgment of God? Certainly, we think that if we do the same things other people do, would we escape the judgment? We tell them not to do it, and we do it ourselves. The problem with this, of course, going back to the mindset of the Jewish people, is it didn't matter what they did because they had a relationship with God, and therefore they were excused. But Paul tells them there's no possible way that can be true. Matthew chapter 7 is another passage we can look at. And of course, verse 21 was already mentioned, but starting in verse 1, perhaps one of the most famous sentences that Jesus spoke, judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the same measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrites! First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So Jesus tells us, then we look at ourselves first. We make sure, before we tell other people what they should do, we make sure that we're not doing the same thing. It should be common sense, but it's easy for us to fool ourselves. We're human beings. And one of the things that I've noticed is that when we look at other people and we look at their activities, we tend to judge them by their actions. And we look at ourselves and our activities. We tend to judge ourselves by our motives. It doesn't matter what our motives are if we're doing what is wrong. And it doesn't matter what their actions are. Well, it does matter what their actions are if their motives are wrong, right or wrong. If your motives are wrong and you're doing the right thing, still wrong. If your motives are right and you're doing the wrong thing, still wrong. We need to make sure we judge properly, and that was Jesus's point. It's not judge not lest you be judged, and there's no context of that whatsoever. We can never make a judgment about another person in any way. That's hogwash. That's ridiculous, really. In fact, he says in the verse that I didn't read there, the next verse, he says, do not give what is holy to the dogs. You can't judge someone. You can't decide whether or not you're going to give what is holy to the dogs unless you judge them as whether they're dogs or not. You have to make a judgment. And we can make judgments about people, but we need to make sure we do them fairly. And in the context here, he's talking about hypocritical judgment. And that is, we condemn other people for things that we gladly do and willingly do. Are we that way? You know, it's very easy. It's easy for us to say, no way I'm that way. The only way we can know about any of these things, whether we're doing what is right, whether we're neglecting to do what is right, whether we're telling people to do something that we don't do, or we tell people not to do things that we are doing, the only way really we can know whether we're doing that or not is to look back on life. Look back in the last week, or the 3 weeks, or month, or 2 months, and ask the question, have I been living the way I say I should live? And if you're not doing what is right, then you need to make changes. But we need to constantly look at ourselves and ask ourselves the question, am I in the faith? Because all of us are really good at convincing ourselves that everything's okay. You know, your brain wants to do that. It doesn't like living in stress and fear. And so what it'll do is it'll come up with all kinds of reasons to give yourself, to convince you that everything's good. That's one of the dangers that we have. It's a protective measure. It's designed to help us, but it actually can shoot us in the foot. So we need to be masters of our own minds, look back at our own lives and say, am I right with God? And recognize the witnesses that come up. The first witness, of course, is our deeds. How do we behave? If you look to the book of 1 John, he emphasizes that time after time after time, over and over and over. It's the things that you do. It's how you behave. This morning, if you're not behaving in the right way, it's time to make changes. And maybe it should be that you need to have prayers at church, prayers of forgiveness. We can go to God on your behalf. If you have sinned against God in a public way and you want people to know that you're repenting of your sins, this is a great opportunity to do that. If it's simply something that you and have in your relationship with God, you realize you're doing things or not doing things that should or shouldn't do, it's time to make things right, and you can make adjustments right now. That's the great thing about God. He's always willing to take us back. If there's anything that we can do to help you, though, won't you please come as we stand and sing.